Okay, so we talked about some geopolitical situations. We were talking about the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. We were talking about borders and sovereignty and control. Now we're going to look at two geopolitical situations that are really focused on water. So you will need your map out again so that we can label a couple of bodies of water and then talk about the geopolitical situations that are going on in the midst of them. So here is our map again. This is, of course, is the Pacific Ocean over here just to the east. But we're going to label three bodies of water that follow the curve of China. And the one in the north up here is the Yellow Sea. And it is called that because of the sediment that comes down the Huanghe River. The Huanghe River starts up here in the highlands and the raised area, the Tibetan Plateau. It starts way up here and then flows across China and empties into this body of water. And there is a huge amount of silt and a huge amount of sediment from way up on those plains, and it's kind of a yellowy brown color, and so it is called the Yellow Sea. Okay, so yet again, we have the impact of sediment on a river system. Then we have the East China Sea, which is logical because it's right off the east coast of China. So that is the body of water that Taiwan is usually considered to be in. And then finally, we have the South China Sea, of the bodies of water that border China. And we already labeled the South China Sea because we talked about it very briefly, mostly just to identify it, when we were talking about Southeast Asia here. Here is Vietnam, right there. And then this is the northern part of the Philippines. So that is the two regions that bridge or that touch, that surround the South China Sea are East Asia and Southeast Asia. Okay, so there's three bodies of water to really be familiar with. And we'll talk about the South China Sea and those geopolitical situations in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about this body of water as well. And this is a controversial one because of the ways that the countries that surround it view it. And each one has their own name for it. So this body of water is called the Sea of Japan, not surprisingly, by the people in Japan. And then it is called the East Sea by people on the Korean Peninsula. And the geopolitical conflict we're going to talk about is mostly between South Korea and Japan. North Korea is not as big a player at this time in this conflict. But this body of water and this dispute about what it should be called and how it should be referred to, how it should be on maps, goes back quite a while. There's a long history of this. Each country has its own old maps that label it the way they think it should be labeled. They've actually taken this to the International Naming Board. There is actually an international board that governs the name of bodies of water and territories, and basically it's part of the UN. And basically they said, you guys are going to have to figure this out. We are not going to pick. For a long time, it was usually called the Sea of Japan and then the East Sea in parentheses. But both countries actually have websites and entire sections of the government devoted to this issue. And the Korean government has really been making strides in the world community of lobbying for their side. And so now most maps have both in the same size font and the same level of prominence. In the midst of the East Sea, the Sea of Japan, there are some very small islands. They're just little bits of land that poke out from over the water. The Koreans call them the Dokdo Islands, and the Japanese call them the Takashima Islands. And so the fact that both countries have names for them also gives you a clue that this is part of that geopolitical debate. Who controls these islands, which territory they should belong to, who controls them, all of those are big parts of this debate, as are the fishing rights in this area. This is a very fertile fishing ground. And if you have, so here's a map of where these little islands are, this little red dot. If this belongs to one country or another, that means that the waters around those islands would be the territory of the country that gains them or that has control of them. So having territorial rights to these waters, and therefore the fishing rights and the crabbing rights in these areas, that is a huge piece of this debate. So the resource here is actually fishing rights. So that's what an awful lot of this comes down to, and it comes down to where you're going to have your territory, what waters you control. It also has extremely important symbolic importance. We've talked about the fact that borders are a deeply emotional issue, that tied to nationalism and the idea of yourself as a country. It's tied to identity here because there is a history of conflict between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. During the lead up to World War II and during World War II, Japan started taking over in large areas of Asia, including the Korean Peninsula. And they were pretty harsh imperialists. The people in South Korea were treated very badly. There was a lot of famine and death. There were women who were forced into prostitution for the army, the Japanese army. There's a lot of bad feeling between the two Koreas, especially South Korea and Japan. Japan continues to deny most of those charges, and textbooks, for example, don't even teach the fact that Japan was going around attacking and taking over other countries. But this issue of nationalism, over access, over history, all of this is tied into this conflict over the name of this body of water and these islands. Okay, and I've linked this video below, but I've got a quick video here. Okay, let's see if it'll start for us. Sometimes this video takes a bit to load. Okay.
The appeal of some real estate isn't immediately obvious. This rocky outcrop, perched between South Korea and Japan, is bleak and hard to reach. But it's important enough to be pushing America's closest Asian allies apart. South Korea controls the island. We went in on a government flight to hear their side of the story. Both countries trace their claims back centuries, but the appeal is largely symbolic. Battered by strong winds and waves, and more than 80 kilometers from the nearest island, it's little surprise that only a handful of people actually live here. One look around at this rocky outcrop here tells you how remote, how inhospitable and uninhabited it is, and yet South Korea is fiercely protective of it. Security personnel here outnumber residents by 10 to 1, and visitors are usually allowed no further than this walkway here. Tensions have been especially high since August, when President Lee Myung-bak became the first South Korean leader to visit the island. Japan retaliated with angry protests, and the resulting row has tapped powerful memories here of Korea's years under Japanese rule.
As a South Korean citizen, I feel strongly that this is our land and that I need to be here to protect it. No other country should lay a finger on it. I'm prepared to be buried here if that's what it takes.
And South Korea has found there are softer ways to showcase your ownership. There's little to see, and the boats only stop for 20 minutes, but this rocky outcrop is being promoted as a tourist site. When I first got off the boat, this woman told me it was so exhilarating. Our textbooks say that Dokdo is South Korean soil, but Japan has been claiming it. Now that I've been here, I feel more than ever that it should be protected and handed down from generation to generation. The police chief himself waves the tourists off. Loneliness is the biggest problem here, he told me. Of course, there are those who like it. A lone fisherman who's lived here for decades described himself as king of the island. Another claim of sovereignty to add to the list. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Dokdo, Takashima.
Okay, so I hope you can see just how emotional this set of islands and this debate is, right? That woman said, I feel like I've visited, I feel now more than ever that this should be our territory. And it really is wrapped up in the past and the long history between the two countries. Oops, looks like I didn't press stop completely on the video, so give me just a sec here. that didn't work. Okay, sorry about that. And another way that you can see the power of this and just the way that culture and identity is wrapped up in geopolitics. Recently, a few years ago, during the beginning parts of President Trump's years in office, there was a summit. There was a big, giant summit in Asia. And he attended, as did the Prime Minister of Japan and South Korea and a whole bunch of other world leaders. And this is the meal that was served. There were some very interesting diplomatic points being made here. First of all, the beef that was served was actually seasoned with a soy sauce that was 360 years old. So the fact that the soy sauce was older than the country of the United States was an interesting political point that South Korea was making about, that the United States is very powerful, but there are things that are even older that need to be considered as well. So there was that. But there was also this prawn right here, this shrimp. And guess which islands that shrimp was caught off of? And if you guessed the Dokdo Takashima Islands, you are exactly correct. This prawn was caught near those islands, and then it was served to all of the dignitaries at this summit, including the diplomat and the leaders from Japan. How do you think the Japanese felt about this point that was being made? There was not a lot of excitement about this. This is the statement in the article. It's unclear whether Mr. Trump took a bite, but Japan was not pleased. They raised concerns about the significance of the prawn at a time when South Korea should unite with Japan to tackle regional issues. Right? So South Korea was making a very clear point here about this geopolitical conflict and using culture, using food to do it. So that's an interesting example of diplomacy. Okay, so we're going to pause here, and then we will come back and talk about the second geopolitical issue that revolves around bodies of water, in this case, the South China Sea.